She laughed. That was the part she kept coming back to afterward. Not what he'd said, not the way he'd said it, tilted toward the others at the table, performing something at her expense. Not the small contractions around the eyes of the two people sitting across from them who'd heard it and looked away. Not her own face, which she couldn't see but knew exactly what it had done. She laughed. Not a real laugh. The specific laugh she'd developed over 3 years for moments like this one. Quick, self-deprecating, designed to signal to the room that she was fine, that she was in on it, that the thing he'd just said was the kind of thing couples said to each other. Harmless, familiar, theirs. She'd gotten good at the laugh. That was what she thought about, driving home from the restaurant in the passenger seat of Derek's car, looking at the dark highway through the window. Not what he'd said, just how quickly the laugh had come, how automatic, how much practice it implied. Derek was talking. He usually talked when driving. She let the sound of it go past her and looked at the highway and thought about how many times she'd done that. The laugh, the redirect, the small internal adjustment that reframed whatever had just happened into something manageable. She'd lost count. That was the problem. If this kind of story, not the dramatic kind, the quiet, everyday kind, lands somewhere for you, subscribe. We look at real human situations here, the ones that accumulate before you notice them. Her name was Mara Delgado, and she was 38. And she had spent a significant portion of the last 3 years explaining Derek Ellis to people. Not defending him. That was the word she avoided. Explaining. Context was important, she said. He was under a lot of pressure at work. His communication style was direct, and not everyone read it correctly. He showed care in ways that weren't conventional. The logistics things, making sure her car was inspected, knowing her coffee order. People who judged him quickly didn't know him the way she did. She was good at the explanations. She'd refine them the way you refine something you say often. She worked in communications for a healthcare organization in Cincinnati, writing, editing, the management of how things sounded, and she was precise with language in the way that becomes second nature after years of choosing words for a living. She knew the difference between explaining and defending. She knew the difference between context and excuse. She was aware, in the particular way of people who work with language, that the same facts can be assembled into very different arguments, and that the argument she'd been making about Derek was one she'd built with significant care and maintained with significant effort. She knew this. She hadn't let herself say it in that order before. She'd told herself the usual things. She was 38. She'd been in a relationship before Derek that had ended badly. A long one. The kind that ends slowly and leaves you with a specific tiredness. Not grief exactly, just the fatigue of having invested for years in something that hadn't returned the investment. When Derek had come along, steady, present, not complicated in the ways her previous relationship had been complicated, she'd felt something that she'd called relief and had not examined what that said about her baseline. 3 years, an apartment together, a lease with both names on it, the accumulated logistics of a shared life, the furniture they'd chosen, the routines they'd built, the social world that had merged into something that was both of theirs and neither of theirs individually. She'd thought about what leaving would require, and the thought was so large and so specific that she'd learned to set it aside quickly, the way you set aside a piece of paper you're not ready to deal with. She told herself, all relationships have friction. She told herself, nobody's perfect. She told herself, stability matters. She had a list of things she told herself, and she'd maintained the list for 3 years. And on the drive home from the restaurant, she thought about the list and felt, for the first time, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been working very hard at a project that was never going to deliver what they'd been told it would. Her colleague's name was Simone. They'd worked together for 2 years. Different teams, overlapping projects, the kind of professional proximity that produces a friendship that starts as work adjacent and then becomes something more specific without either person deciding it should. They had lunch on Thursdays and talked about the work and about everything else. Simone was 42, divorced, 2 years out of it, and had the particular clear-eyed quality of someone who had been inside a situation and had come out the other side and could see both views from where she now stood. She didn't give advice. She asked questions. The Thursday after the restaurant, she asked, "What did he actually say?" Mara told her. She told it the way she usually told it, with context, with framing, with the appropriate qualifiers. His week had been rough. The other couple at the table were old friends of his who had a particular dynamic. It was more about his sense of humor than anything directed at her. Simone listened to all of it. "Okay," she said, "but what did he actually say?" Mara set her fork down. She said the words, without the framing, without the context, just the sentence Derek had said, leaning toward their friends with the expression he got when he was performing something, at Mara's expense, in the specific way that is dressed as a joke because jokes have the defense of not being serious. Simone looked at her for a moment. "And you laughed," Simone said. You told me you laughed." "I did. Why?" Mara looked at her plate. "Because if I don't," she said, "it becomes a thing. And then the drive home is bad, and the night is bad, and I'm the one who doesn't have a sense of humor and can't take a joke, and it's more work than just—" She stopped. Simone waited. "Than just laughing," Mara said. "Than just absorbing it," Simone said. Mara didn't answer. "Can I ask you something?" Simone said. "Not about Derek, about you." Mara looked at her. "When's the last time he made you feel like he was on your side in a room?" The question sat on the table between them. Mara thought about it. She tried to find an example, a recent one, something she could give Simone as evidence. Something from the past month, the past 2 months. She moved through the catalog of recent evenings, recent gatherings. She was looking for a moment where she'd said something and he'd not just agreed, she wasn't asking for agreement, but where she'd felt, physically felt, the particular ease of having someone standing slightly behind you. She couldn't find one from the past 2 months. She went back further, 3 months, 4. She found individual things, the car inspection, the coffee order, the birthday, which he'd remembered and made a dinner reservation for. She assembled these into a case. "He does things," she said. "I know he does things," Simone said. "The birthday." "Mara." Simone's voice was not unkind, just direct. "Things are not the same as being on your side." Mara looked at the restaurant window, the Thursday street outside, the ordinary midday Cincinnati. "I know that," she said quietly. "I know you know that," Simone said. "I'm asking when you started pretending you didn't." She drove home that evening with the question sitting in the passenger seat. She didn't resolve it. She parked and went upstairs and made dinner in the kitchen while Derek watched something in the other room. And she thought about the question with the part of her brain that didn't stop thinking just because other things were happening. When's the last time he made you feel like he was on your side in a room? The apartment was comfortable. This was something she returned to regularly. The apartment was comfortable. The life was comfortable. The baseline hum of her days was not unhappy, and unhappy was the threshold she'd set. Not, does this make me feel full? Not, does this make me feel like myself? Unhappy. She'd set the bar at unhappy and cleared it reliably, and called that a working relationship. Derek came to the kitchen for something and said he was thinking about ordering food instead. Did she want anything? She said she was already making something. He looked at the pot on the stove, said he wasn't really feeling pasta, and ordered himself something from his phone. He went back to the other room. She stood at the stove and stirred the pasta. It wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She knew that. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't something she could point to as the thing, the moment, the proof. It was just, she was making dinner, and he was ordering food, and the apartment had two people in it who were moving around each other without connecting. And she'd been calling this a relationship for 3 years. She ate her pasta at the kitchen table. He ate his food in the other room. She washed the pot. She brushed her teeth. She got into bed on her side. He came to bed an hour later and was asleep in 7 minutes, the way he always was, with the undisturbed sleep of someone who did not carry anything to bed with them. She lay on her side and looked at the wall. She thought about Simone's question. She thought about the restaurant. She thought about the laugh and how many times she'd done it, and how automatic it was, and what that meant about how long she'd been training herself to make it automatic. She thought about a word she'd been avoiding. Dignity. She thought about that word and what she'd been spending it on. The woman's name was Beverly. She was 67, lived 2 floors above Mara in the building where Mara had lived before Derek, and where Mara's friend Camille still lived. The building where Mara spent the occasional weekend when she and Simone had plans in that neighborhood, and it was easier than driving. Camille and Beverly had the kind of neighbor friendship that builds over years. Not intimacy, but the comfortable familiarity of 2 people who see each other regularly and have learned each other's shapes. She'd met Beverly through Camille at Camille's birthday party 2 years ago. Beverly had come for 20 minutes with a bottle of wine and the specific self-possession of a woman who appears at parties without requiring anything from them. She was compact and direct, gray hair kept short, the kind of person who doesn't fill silences for the sake of filling them. Mara had talked to her then, briefly. She'd remembered her, not because of anything specific that was said, but because there was a quality to Beverly that Mara had filed somewhere and not retrieved. A quality of being completely where she was. She saw her again in April. Camille had a dinner, small, 4 people, the comfortable kind. Beverly was there. She was in the chair by the window for most of it, contributing to the conversation when something interested her and listening when it didn't, which Mara found she was paying attention to because she'd been trying, lately, to notice what it looked like when someone took up exactly the space they wanted, and no more, and no less. After dinner, when Camille and the other guest were in the kitchen, Beverly and Mara were briefly alone in the living room. Beverly said, without particular preamble, "How are things?" Not an opener. The question of a woman who wanted an actual answer. Mara looked at her. She thought about the standard response. She thought about Derek, the apartment, the 3 years, the restaurant laugh. She said, "Not great, actually." Beverly nodded. She looked at the window. "I was in a marriage for 11 years, Beverly said, where I was not great for approximately 9 of them. She said it the way she said things, evenly, without performing the difficulty of it. I kept doing the math on what leaving would cost, and I kept deciding the math was wrong, that I'd done it incorrectly, that surely it wasn't as bad as it sometimes seemed." "What changed it?" Mara said. "I stopped asking whether I was unhappy enough," Beverly said, "and started asking whether I recognized myself." She looked at Mara. "I'd been making these small adjustments for so long, how I talked in rooms, what I laughed at, how big I made myself in different situations. And one day I looked in a mirror and I couldn't quite find myself in there." Mara held her wine glass. "I was 52, Beverly said, when I left. I thought, I'm going to be alone at 52, and I was terrified of that." She paused. "And then I was, alone. And it was," she considered the word, "it was so quiet. And the quiet was mine. And I realized I'd been afraid of the wrong thing." Camille called something from the kitchen. Beverly turned her head. "What were you afraid of?" Mara said. Beverly looked back at her. "Being unwanted," she said. "I thought alone meant unwanted. It doesn't. It just means alone." She picked up her wine. "Alone is neutral. What you thought you needed company to escape from is still there when you get back. The difference is you face it clearly instead of making someone else responsible for managing it. Camille came back in. The evening continued. Mara drove home at 10:30 on a Friday night, and the apartment was dark when she got there, and Derek was already asleep. And she stood in the kitchen in the dark for a minute before she turned the light on. She didn't do anything dramatic. She'd expected that when the moment came, she would do something decisive, have the conversation, make the announcement, draw the line. The way these things happened in the parts of the story she'd been telling herself, where the pivot was clear and the moment was unmistakable. What she did instead was small and persistent and took 3 months. She stopped laughing when she didn't find something funny. It started in a room she didn't plan for, a Sunday brunch with 2 couples they were friendly with, one of whom she actually liked and one of whom she tolerated because Derek did. And Derek was in the form he was in when he had an audience. Expansive, the version of himself he showed to rooms. He said something. The familiar shape of it, pointed in her direction, dressed as warmth, carrying underneath it something that was neither. She looked at him. She didn't laugh. She didn't redirect. She didn't perform the version that said, "Yes, this is fine. We are fine. Everything is familiar and comfortable here." She picked up her coffee and looked at the table. He noticed. She felt him notice. The fractional recalibration. The sense of a variable behaving differently than expected. He moved on. The conversation moved on. Nothing catastrophic, but something had changed in her. Small, the size of a decision, which is what it was. The second thing she did was call Simone. Not to process Derek. She'd been processing Derek with Simone for months in the way that processing becomes its own loop if you're not careful. She called to say, "I think I've been afraid of something, and I've been calling it love." Simone said, "I know." "You could have said that 6 months ago," Mara said. "You had to say it," Simone said. The third thing was smaller. She started going for walks alone in the evening. Not long ones, just the ones she'd stopped taking because it had seemed at some point easier to stay in the apartment, easier to be in the same space as someone, even if that space was parallel and not connected. She walked and thought nothing in particular, and found that the nothing in particular was more restoring than the evenings she'd been spending performing okayness in her own apartment. She was learning something she didn't have a clean word for yet. The dinner was in May. They'd been invited to his coworker Ryan's place. A regular thing, a rotation of couples they saw monthly. She liked Ryan's wife, Sarah, who was direct and funny and one of the few people in Derek's social world who talked to Mara as though she were a complete entity rather than Derek's person. She'd been sitting next to Sarah for most of dinner when Derek said it. It wasn't the worst thing he'd ever said. It wasn't even in the top 5. She could have categorized it as she'd categorized other things, could have run the familiar process. His week had been difficult. He was performing. The others hadn't really heard it, but Sarah had. Sarah looked at Mara, not with pity. She wasn't that kind of person. Just with the specific attention of someone who sees something and wants the other person to know they've seen it. Mara looked back at her. She didn't laugh. Derek looked at her. She felt the look, the slight expectation of it, waiting for the familiar seal on the moment. She looked at her plate. She picked up her fork and ate something, and let the moment be unresolved in the way she hadn't let moments be unresolved in 3 years. The dinner continued. She talked to Sarah. She talked to Ryan. At 10, she said she was tired and she was going to head out. Derek said he'd stay a bit. She said okay. She drove home alone. She walked into the apartment and turned on the lamp in the living room. She put her keys on the hook. She sat on the couch and looked at the room. The furniture they'd chosen. The things that were hers and the things that were his and the things that were neither. She thought about Beverly and the quiet that was mine. She thought about Simone's question. When's the last time he made you feel like he was on your side in a room? She thought about the catalog she'd gone through and the things she'd found and what they said about the difference between someone doing things for you and someone being present with you. She thought about the laugh, how quickly it had come, how long it had been coming. Derek came home at 12:30. She was still up, which surprised him. He looked at her with the slight wariness of someone who recognizes an atmosphere. She didn't fight. That wasn't where she was. She said, "I want to talk about something. Not tonight, but soon." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen. She heard the sound of the refrigerator, a glass, water from the tap. He came back. He sat in the chair across from her. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. 3 years. The coffee order, the car inspection, the birthday reservation, the restaurant, the brunch, the dinner, the laugh, and how many times? "Not tonight," she said again. He nodded. She turned the lamp off and went to bed. The conversation happened on a Saturday. She'd spent the week not rehearsing it. Every time she started composing it in her head, she stopped because she'd learned from Simone that she used language to construct arguments, and she didn't want to construct an argument. She wanted to say something true. So she'd let it sit, and on Saturday morning, she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and when Derek came in, she said, "I want to talk about us." He sat down. She didn't tell him everything she'd been thinking. She didn't give him the catalog. She said, "I've been unhappy for a long time. Not because of any one thing, because of the shape of how we are together." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means I've been making myself smaller to make this work for a long time, and I don't want to do that anymore." He said, "I didn't ask you to." She looked at him. "I know you didn't ask me to," she said. "That's not how it works. That's not how it ever works." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the table. The kitchen they'd divided between them without deciding to, the cup she always used and the cup he always used in their separate places on the shelf. "I think we should separate," she said. She said it, and it was out, and the air in the room didn't change. The apartment didn't change. Nothing catastrophic happened. She'd been afraid. She'd been afraid for years, in the back of the fear that had kept her adjusting the argument, that saying this would be the end of something she couldn't survive the end of. The apartment was quiet. The morning was outside the window, already going, a May Saturday with its particular quality of light. "Okay," Derek said. Not a concession, not a fight, just okay. The word of a man who had also known, somewhere, and who had perhaps been waiting as long as she had for the thing to be said. They sat at the table for a while and talked about the practical things, the lease, the furniture, the transition. They were careful with each other in the way that people who are finished with each other sometimes are. The carefulness of a thing that no longer has anything at stake, which is its own specific quality. Not warmth, but not cruelty either. Just the management of an ending. He moved out 6 weeks later. The first night alone was a Wednesday. She'd expected it to feel like something large. She'd been afraid of it for long enough that the fear had its own shape, its own weight, and she'd been so accustomed to carrying the fear that she'd stopped distinguishing it from the situation itself. She came home from work. The apartment was hers, all of it. The things that had been his removed, and the spaces they'd left still visible. She put her bag down. She turned on the lamp. She stood in the living room. It was quiet. The particular quiet of a space that belongs to one person. She'd forgotten what it felt like. Or maybe she'd never lived with it. She'd gone from her parents' house to college, to the long relationship, and then to Derek, always surrounded by someone else's noise, someone else's baseline. She stood in the quiet and waited for the thing she'd been afraid of. It didn't arrive. Not the way she'd expected it. What arrived was something she didn't have a word for immediately. She stood in the living room, and the apartment was quiet, and the lamp was on, and the evening was hers. Hers to do whatever she was going to do with, no performance necessary, no adjustments required. And she felt something in her chest that took her a moment to identify. Not happy. That wasn't it. More like here, present in a room without managing the room, occupying her own space without monitoring how she was being received. She went to the kitchen and made dinner. She made it slowly, the way she wanted to make it. Something that took more time than was practical on a weeknight, because she had the time and the kitchen to herself. She ate at the table with the book open, which she'd stopped doing when Derek was there because he'd found it rude. She read and ate, and the apartment was quiet around her. And she let the quiet be what it was. She called Simone after. "How is it?" Simone said. "Strange," Mara said. "Quiet." Good strange or bad strange? She thought about it. She looked at the lamp, the room, the Wednesday evening that belonged entirely to her. "I don't know yet," she said. "But not bad. Not the way I thought it would be." Simone was quiet for a moment. "The bad part comes sometimes," she said. "It will. But so does the other part." "Beverly told me something," Mara said. "She said she thought alone meant unwanted, and it doesn't." "Smart woman," Simone said. "I've been afraid of the wrong thing," Mara said, "for a long time." "Most people are," Simone said. "Doesn't make it faster to figure out." Mara looked at the window. The street outside, the ordinary Wednesday. People walking past who had their own Wednesdays going on inside. "I know," she said. They talked a while longer. When she hung up, she sat in the quiet and didn't fill it. She saw Beverly 2 weeks after Derek moved out. She'd gone to Camille's on a Saturday, the easy kind of Saturday. Coffee, no occasion. Beverly came by with something she'd borrowed from Camille and ended up staying, the way Beverly sometimes did when the room was comfortable and the conversation was not requiring anything from her. At some point, Camille was in the other room. Beverly looked at Mara. "How are you?" "Better," Mara said, and meant it in the specific way that better is not yet good, but is something real. Beverly nodded once. "You look different," she said. Mara thought about this. "I feel different," she said. "I'm not sure it's anything visible." "It is," Beverly said. She said it simply, the way she said things that were observations rather than compliments. "I've been afraid a lot," Mara said, "for a long time. Of being alone, of having made the wrong choices, of it being too late for—" She stopped. "I don't know. For whatever I was afraid it was too late for." "Is it too late?" Beverly said. Mara looked at her. "I'm 38, she said. Beverly gave her the look, the one that said, "That's not an answer." "No," Mara said, "it's not too late." "Then stop treating 38 like it's an apology," Beverly said. Camille came back with coffee. The conversation moved. Mara sat in Camille's living room and drank her coffee and said things and listened and felt, slowly, the particular pleasure of being in a room as herself, not a version of herself that had been adjusted for someone else's comfort. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have been notable, but she noticed it. The weeks after were not linear. She'd expected, partly from the stories she'd been told by culture and partly from her own sense of narrative, that there would be a turn, a before and after, a clear division between the person who had laughed at things that weren't funny and the person she was going to be. There wasn't. There were mornings she woke up in the apartment and lay in the quiet for a long time, thinking about the shape of what she'd been in those 3 years, and feeling something between grief and relief that she couldn't fully sort into categories. There were evenings that were long and didn't resolve into anything particular. There were evenings that were fine, genuinely, simply fine, in the way that evenings can be fine when no performance is required and the only baseline you're meeting is your own. She called her mother more. Not to talk about Derek. She'd talked about Derek with her mother at the beginning, and her mother had been what mothers are, which is to say both more and less helpful than you need. But just to talk. About the city, about the work, about a thing she'd read. Her mother said she sounded good. She said she didn't know what that meant. Her mother said, "Clear. You sound clear." She thought about that word for a few days. She'd been working for the past several years in the constant low-level effort of maintaining a version of herself that was compatible with someone else's preferences and assumptions and comfort. That effort had been so constant and so low-level that she'd stopped experiencing it as effort. It had become ambient, the background hum of her daily life, and she'd called the hum normalcy. Without it, there was something that felt, at first, like emptiness. She'd spent the first weeks waiting for the emptiness to become unbearable. It hadn't. It had become something else. A kind of quiet that was neutral, the way Beverly had said, not the absence of something wanted, just the presence of space. Space that she could, gradually, fill with things she actually wanted in it. She started painting again. She hadn't painted since her late 20s. She'd stopped because she'd been busy, and then because she'd been with someone who found the mess of it impractical, and then because the habit had atrophied and starting again had felt like too large a declaration. She bought supplies on a Saturday in June and set up on the kitchen table and painted something bad on a Tuesday evening and left it out to dry, and walked past it all week, and on Saturday painted something slightly less bad. It wasn't about the painting. It was about the table and the mess and the Tuesday evening that went where she wanted it to go. She had dinner with Simone every Thursday. She had coffee with Camille when they could manage it. She went to Beverly's twice, once because Camille was sick and couldn't make their standing plan, and once because she wanted to, and Beverly opened the door with the look and made tea, and they sat in the specific quiet of Beverly's apartment that Mara had started to understand was not the absence of warmth, but the presence of chosen things. She asked Beverly on the second visit what the first year had been like, after she'd left. Beverly was quiet for a moment. She had her mug in both hands, the way she held things she was thinking about. "Hard," she said. "And also, I kept being surprised by ordinary things." She looked at the window. "I'd do something small, make dinner, watch what I wanted to watch, take a walk at a time that made sense to me, and feel this small, what's the word? Not triumph, just," she paused, "jurisdiction. My own jurisdiction." Mara thought about that word. "I think I'm starting to understand that," she said. "You will," Beverly said. "More than you expect." In July, Mara had a work event, the kind that requires attendance and some amount of presence. A reception, an open bar, people she knew professionally in a room that required her to be on in the vague, sociable way of professional evenings. She'd always found these events slightly exhausting. She'd managed the exhaustion when Derek was with her by staying near him, using his ease in rooms as a structure she could operate within, deferring to his social pace. He wasn't there. She was there alone, in the professional sense, and she stood in the room with her drink and talked to people and listened to people and said the correct things and found, somewhere around the second hour, that she was doing it differently. Not performing ease, not managing herself into the shape the room seemed to require, just there, in the room, in the way she was. She talked to a woman she'd known for years in a professional capacity and had never had a real conversation with, and the conversation was actually interesting, and she was interested, and said so without the reflex of checking whether her interest was being approved of. She talked to a colleague about a project and had opinions about the project, and expressed them without the familiar internal negotiation about how much space her opinion was allowed. She drove home at 9. She put her keys on the hook. She took her shoes off. She sat on the couch. The apartment was quiet. She didn't feel afraid of the quiet. She sat in it, and it was just quiet. A Thursday evening, a room that was hers, the city doing its city things outside the window. She thought about what she'd felt at the reception. Not triumph, not relief, something more fundamental than either. She'd been in a room, and she'd been herself in it, and there had been no cost for that. No adjustment required, no laugh deployed, no monitoring of someone else's temperature. She'd just been a person in a room. It seemed like such a small thing to have taken 38 years to find. She called Simone on a Sunday in August. She called to say something she'd been wanting to say for a while, but had been waiting until she could say it without needing it to be the whole story. She said, "I think I'm okay." Simone said, "Yeah?" "Not fixed," Mara said. "Not sorted. I still have long evenings sometimes. I still—" She paused. "I miss being known. That's still hard. Not Derek specifically, just the idea of being known by someone." "That's not going away," Simone said. "It's just not worth trading for what you had." "I know," Mara said. "I know that now." "So what's the okay part?" Mara looked around her apartment. The painting she'd made, the less bad one, propped against the wall because she hadn't decided where to hang it. The table with the coffee cup that was always in the same place. The lamp. "I'm not afraid of the apartment anymore," she said. "I come home and it's quiet and it's mine. And I don't feel like I'm being punished." Simone was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," Mara said. "It turns out it's not." They talked until the afternoon was most of the way gone. About the work and about a trip Simone was planning, and about a book Mara had been reading. The conversation wandered the way good conversations wander, not toward anything, just through things. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the Sunday quiet. She thought about Beverly's word, jurisdiction, her own jurisdiction. The small, ordinary things, the painting on the kitchen table, the walk at the time that made sense, the Thursday evening she left when she was ready to leave. She thought about the laugh, the specific laugh, the one she developed and deployed and practiced into fluency. She hadn't used it in months. She hadn't needed to. She hung the painting in September. She'd been moving it around, propping it against different walls, trying different places. And it had been in the corner by the bookshelf for 3 weeks when she finally found the spot for it. The wall beside the kitchen, visible from the table, visible from the couch. Not a great painting, she knew that, but it was the one she'd made, and she'd made it in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening and left it out to dry, and looking at it every day was the small, private fact of having done a thing for no reason except that she wanted to. She stood back and looked at it. Not triumph. Not the punctuation of a story that was finished. Just a painting on a wall in an apartment that was hers, on a September afternoon, in the continued life of a woman who was still figuring out what she wanted in it. She went and made coffee. She sat at the table with her book open, the way she did now, the way she'd forgotten she was allowed to do. She read and drank her coffee, and the apartment was quiet, and the painting was on the wall, and the afternoon did what afternoons do. She was 38, and she was alone, in the honest way that she was learning, slowly, to understand as neutral. Alone, just alone. Not unwanted, not abandoned, not punished. Just a woman in a room that was hers, with a cup of coffee and a book and a painting she'd made herself, and nothing required of her except to be there. She was there. If something in this story reached you, not the ending, but somewhere in the middle of it, the part that was familiar, leave a word in the comments. You don't have to explain it. Sometimes it's enough just to put it somewhere outside yourself for a minute.